I started talking about the corruption on the Attawapiskat Indian Reserve in December of 2011. I told you about their dozens of overpaid bureaucrats and politicians, all for a tiny town of just 1,500 people, just 300 homes. Now, in the past 13 months, and especially over the past week, I've detailed the massive waste and mismanagement and the piles of cash that coexist in that Indian Reserve alongside abject poverty, leaky roofs, and third world style shacks. Seriously, you've got a chief driving a Cadillac Escalade next to people living in tents in minus 30-degree weather. I mean, there's $8.9 million in their stock portfolio. They bought a $96,000 new Zamboni to replace the old Zamboni. $200,000 on gifts last year. $36,000 on a goose hunt. I mean, Chief's boyfriend bills $850 a day, but he hasn't bothered to write a budget. You get my drift. The place is a mess. But until this morning, no one else seemed to care about the mess. The media party played the chief herself as a victim. And when she came to Ottawa with her fake hunger strike, they all played along. Being seen with Theresa Spence at her teepee was the must-do photo op for politicians looking to get in the news and seem deeply caring. Even this old fossil, Canada's least successful Prime Minister, Paul Martin, pulled himself out of obscurity to try to get some ink and airtime with the starving chief. Look at this.
I just told her that she really was she'd become really an inspiration for all Canadians.
Good Lord, that's embarrassing. And here's CTV's Kevin Newman interviewing not Spence herself, but one of her many hangers-on.
We lit that sacred fire for a reason. Many thousands of years ago, the Christ Jesus was born from the Virgin Mary, and this is a different situation, but the same story where a fire needs to be lit, and people are praying for hope and salvation, and that's the basis of this gathering of all people, of all nations, and so therefore this was a calling.
So Kevin Newman, I didn't show him in the screen there, was interviewing what you saw there was a top-notch journalist. I'm Kevin Newman, he's top-notch, of a leading TV news station interviewing the spin doctor of Theresa Spence, not Theresa Spence herself. And instead of answers about spending and accountability, that spin doctor compared Chief Spence to Jesus Christ, didn't he? And Kevin Newman just listens and nods piously. I mean, imagine if it were a non-Indian politician saying that, especially a conservative Christian, someone like, I don't know, Stockwell Day or Preston Manning or Stephen Harper himself, comparing themselves to Jesus. Could you imagine the reaction? But this political spin doctor we just saw there knew that the main reason Indian politicians get away with things that white politicians can't is that white journalists get very reverential in the presence of Indian politicians, like there's some sort of spiritual gurus or something, and no one is better at manipulating journalists than Theresa Spence. And as we alone at The Sun have looked through the mumbo-jumbo and just reported on the facts, other journalists actually started to take sides against us, trying to undermine our criticisms. What I mean is, other journalists started digging through Attawapiskat's financials, but not to expose corruption. They were looking to nitpick me to find errors in my reporting. They weren't reporting the news. They were trying to undo my own reporting of the news. Here's just one obvious example from the Aboriginal People's TV network, APTN.
It really does come across as trying to discredit the chief. Now, there is some information in there that's very accurate, the $850 a day, for example. But a lot of the rest of it seems to be sliding one step past the truth.
Really? Now, the audit, of course, just demolished what he said there, but I don't think that TV channel should be called the Aboriginal People's TV Network. They should be called the Aboriginal Chiefs TV Network, doing their best to cover for the waste and corruption of the chiefs. To hell with what ordinary Indians have to live under. Look, there was this whole cottage industry out of mocking me and The Sun, the only folks doing real reporting here, until they were strategically leaked the new audit by Deloitte. It was the smart move by the Conservative government to allow these left-wing journalists to get into the story by having an exclusive. And given that it was spoon-fed to them by the government, they didn't have to actually do any real work themselves. So it made it to the front page of the Star, CBC, La Presse, etc. Except that, of course, you just can't trust the media party to investigate an Indian band, especially one whose chief is so hostile to Stephen Harper. They just can't bring themselves to do it. Here's a copy of the Deloitte audit. As you can see, it was sent to Chief Spence herself on August 28th of last year. So she knew it was coming. She knew it was going to be a doozy and embarrassing. I wonder if that had anything to do with the fact that she went on her PR blitz against Harper now. You know, the best defense is a good offense. Maybe she thought that if she became the hero of the anti-Harper left, that her corruption would be given a pass. Well, that strategy actually worked well until yesterday, but Then the Star and the CBC and La Presse ran with their audit. But did they tell you everything? Of course they didn't. Here, I will. Now, I didn't go to journalism school. I'm not fancy like that. But I can read an audit. Let's look at the fine print here. Here's what Deloitte did. They didn't review every single cent spent by the Indian Reserve in 5 years. That would have been an impossibly enormous task. Instead, they randomly sampled 505 different transactions to check if they were done properly. You know, if there was an invoice, if there was a contract, if the work was done, if people signed the checks properly. Now, of course, not all of the transactions in the ban were fraudulent, but an astounding number, and I'm quoting here, let me quote, 81% of files did not have adequate supporting documents, and over 60% had no documentation of any reason, of the reason for the payment, unquote. So the vast majority of the money just went out the door, and nobody knows what for. Here's another quote from the Deloitte audit. Quote, there is no evidence of due diligence in the use of public funding, including the use of funds for housing. In our opinion, having over 80% of the selected transactions lacking any proper supporting documentation is inappropriate for any recipient of public funds, unquote. You think? So the government, translation the rest of us, guilty white liberals really, send tens of millions of dollars up there every year to repair leaky roofs and things like that, but it's not being used for that purpose. Oh, I'm shocked. Chief Teresa and her boyfriend, well, they look so trustworthy. Here's more from the Deloitte audit. Quote, the lack of financial management controls to support compliance with the terms and conditions of the agreements is inconsistent with the requirements of the funding agreements with the Government of Canada. We were unable to determine if the funds were spent for their intended purpose, unquote. So let me just be clear. It's not only a moral and political and accounting scandal here. It's a violation of the agreement between the band and the federal government. To get the money from us, the band had to comply with basic governance and accounting. They're not doing that. No wonder they kicked out the independent financial supervisor that Harper sent to the band last year. That third world stunt, kicking out the financial manager, was actually upheld by a judge named Michael Fallon, who actually upheld Chief Spence's kicking out of an independent financial watchdog. Seriously, I've heard of independent auditors being sent into places by courts. I've never heard of one being kicked out of a place by a court. But Judge Fallon actually ruled last year, and I'm quoting here, quote, the federal government has not produced evidence of mismanagement or incorrect spending, unquote. Seriously? Here's one more quote from the new Deloitte audit. Ready? Attawapiskat First Nation did not provide us with any job descriptions for individuals who were involved in the financial management of funding agreements with Aboriginal Affairs and Northern Development Canada and Health Canada. So there are people on the payroll up there, but they don't have job descriptions. There are no budgets. There are no minutes of meetings. There are no documents showing why checks were cut. My friends, this is shocking to you and me, but it's normal on Indian reserves. It's been going on for years in Attawapiskat and hundreds of other reserves too.